The president of a Canadian NGO chanted, quote, "Death to America," and other pro-Islamic Republic in Iran slogans.
Heavily redacted documents show that Ottawa is preparing legal arguments in case Albertans successfully vote in a referendum to separate from confederation.
A Gazan-Canadian organization is attempting to organize cross-country protests demanding that the Canadian government brings their family members from Gaza into Canada. Hello Canada, it's Friday, June 27th, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Cosmin, Dzsurdzsa.
And I'm Clayton, DeMaine.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. A video going viral on Canadian social media shows Firas al-Najim chanting common Islamic Republic phrases in Persian, glorifying Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and chanting "Death to America" in front of the U.S. consulate in Toronto. Al-Najim is the founder and head of the Canadian Defenders for Human Rights organization, an NGO that has taken pro-Islamic Republic stances publicly, such as lobbying the Canadian government during a committee hearing to remove the terrorist designation from the Iran-backed Hezbollah group in Lebanon. Last month, his organization called on the Canadian military to, quote, "send troops and arms to the Palestinian resistance in occupied Palestine, Gaza," and pleaded with Prime Minister Mark Carney to, quote, "call on David McGuinty, Defense Minister, to assist the liberation process." Al-Najim spoke earlier this month with Press TV, an Iranian state broadcaster, where he shared his views on the Iran-Israel confrontation, warning that any U.S. military actions against Iran would be a, quote, "foolish move." Canada is already grappling with concerns about potential Iranian sleeper cells and regime officials hiding in Canada who could potentially target Iranian dissidents, according to former Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. With growing anti-Israel sentiments in Canada, the Islamic Republic regime has seen increased support on Canadian streets. Carney spoke with CNN's Christine Amanpour, where he said, quote, "the position of Iran has been substantially degraded with regard to their nuclear capabilities, and that the Iranian response was, quote, consistent with leading up to a de-escalation." Clayton, it's been quite some time now where we've seen at least the Palestine protest happening. It's been over a year, in fact. And now they seem to blend with these protests in support of the Iranian Islamic Republic. So what precedent has been set from individual people or groups in Canada when it comes to shouting things like "Death to America" on Canadian streets? And is there any accountability for these individuals when they call for a destruction of our neighbor?
Yeah, so our listeners might recall during a protest in Vancouver, just a day after the first marking of the Hamas-led October 7th massacre in Israel, an organization True North has been writing about for months prior, Sammy Doohan, recorded themselves burning the Canadian flag and chanting "Burn, burn Canada, burn, burn America" in Israel. Although Jewish advocacy groups have been calling out this group for years as its openly celebrated terrorist groups and continuously posting homages to avowed terrorists and bragging about using Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine material, the flag burning was the moment Canadian politicians had enough. So, by the way, the group has been operating in Canada as a charity, receiving tax-exempt status from the Canadian Revenue Agency the whole time. It's been promoting terrorism and spreading anti-West messages. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre called on that group to be listed as a terrorist entity, and Public Safety Canada later agreed that it was operating as a front for the PFLP, a Marxist-Leninist terrorist group. They're also suing the Canadian government, Pierre Poilievre and Trudeau, but we won't get into that. But True North has written about this guy, Firas al-Najim, before, Interestingly enough, the guy tried to host a Remembrance Day type vigil in November honoring the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. And for our listeners, if you don't know, Hamas's charter states that their goal is to, quote, vanquish their enemy, the Jews. Many Jewish advocates highlight that honoring Sinwar would be like hosting a vigil service to honor the martyrdom of Adolf Hitler while insulting the sacred day of remembrance that Western countries like Canada and the UK hold for their veterans. This raises questions if saying death to America or the like constitutes incitement of violence. And if it's not convictable, I think Canadians know what people like this mean when they use phrases that are popularized by terrorist groups and their leaders in Canada. Heavily redacted documents show that Ottawa is seeking constitutional advice on Alberta's independence from a top Crown lawyer who successfully argued in the Supreme Court that Quebec had no unilateral right to leave Canada after the narrow 1995 separation vote. In response to a Freedom of Information and Privacy Act request by True North, the Department of Justice released legal correspondence on Alberta's proposed independence referendum. In response to a Freedom of Information and Privacy Act request by True North, the Department of Justice released legal correspondence on Alberta's proposed independence referendum. Citing solicitor-client privilege, a vast majority of the document's contents were blacked out, except for the names of those consulted. Correspondence dated from May 15th to May 23rd contains emails between the Department of Justice's Senior General Counsel on Constitutional Law, Warren J. Newman, Senior General Counsel on Indigenous Rights and Relations, Uzma Isinula, and Crown Indigenous Relations Senior Director, John Topping. Despite the Liberal government downplaying the magnitude of the Alberta independence movement, the documents indicate that Ottawa may be making contingency plans to constitutionally challenge a successful referendum, possibly at the Supreme Court level, by employing arguments of Indigenous rights. Newman acted as co-counsel for the Attorney General of Canada in 1998 when the Liberal government under Jean Chrétien shut down Quebec secessionist arguments in the Supreme Court of Canada. The court had agreed with the Crown's arguments in its reference re-secession of Quebec judgment. The court ruled that Quebec could not legally secede from Canada on its own because the Canadian Constitution does not allow it, and that secession could only happen through negotiations involving all provinces and the federal government. So, Cosmin, after the last election, we've seen a lot of a resurgence of this sentiment of Alberta separatism. Now, that might not be enough to actually have a successful referendum, but if there was a successful referendum, what are some of the legal arguments that are likely to be at play?
Yeah, Clayton, while I'm not a constitutional legal expert who knows the ins and outs of secessionist movement history within Canada, it's evident from these documents, these emails, that the federal government is sort of preparing a response to what could be a successful referendum. And it seems to be a two-pronged response. On the one hand, they're consulting somebody who was the co-counsel on the 1998 reference case for the Quebec referendum that was super close. It was a razor-thin margin. I think it was like almost 50.5% to 49.4% against voting for a separation of Quebec. But they're consulting the co-counsel from that case, and at the same time, they're looping in people and counsel from within the Indigenous Affairs Department. So that, to me, says they want to look at this based on the historical precedent, but then also raise some of the arguments that are currently at play within Alberta itself from First Nations there, who are essentially telling the provincial government that they were going to refuse acknowledging any referendum that votes for Alberta to separate from Confederation. Whether that actually is a credible argument, legally speaking, because we've had legal experts say that it doesn't matter. First Nations do not have the right to veto if a majority votes to separate from confederation in a province, but they would have the option after that separation to either remain within the province or the new country that forms or remain within Canada uh, with regard to their existing agreements. So, yeah, there's a lot of history here. And like I said, I'm not an expert. Most of this stuff happened when I was just a tiny kid. But a lot of things are at play. There was that 1998 reference. And one of the things about the Quebec separation referendum from 1995 was the problem that the language itself of the referendum wasn't super clear. And that prompted the government, the federal government under Harper, to introduce the Clarity Act, which mandated pre approval of the clarity of a referendum question and also some more clarity on what a majority threshold actually is to pass a referendum of that nature. Self-identified Gazan-Canadians are organizing countrywide encampment-style protests outside immigration offices and Parliament Hill. They are demanding that Ottawa accept family members of Palestinians already living in Canada. A group that calls itself the Gazan-Canadians League are attempting to organize nationwide sit-in protests outside the federal legislature and federally run Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada buildings on July 15th, 2025, a day before Parliament is set to return from a break. In a post promoting the protests, the group said, quote, "Stand with Gazan-Canadians. We have exhausted every door. Now we ask you grassroots movements, organizations, and caring people to stand with us. We will stay until Canada reunites our families and fulfills its promise. While immigrants and refugees are not guaranteed that their entire families can join them in Canada, there are formal pathways and processes they can pursue to petition the government for family reunification. The Gazan-Canadian group has over 3,500 followers on Instagram and describes itself in another post as Palestinians living in Canada who advocate for the reunification of their families in Gaza. The group argues that the visa program announced by former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take in Gazan refugees has been racist, discriminatory, and an overly complex process. The Gazan-Canadians have exhausted all other avenues for family reunification, criticizing Canada for its, quote, lack of real urgency and action on the matter. Some of the group's posts, including a post saying the delay is, quote, institutional racism, were liked by anti-Israel groups such as Palestinian Youth Movement Toronto, Independent Jewish Voices Toronto, York Region BDS, and IJV U of T, and union groups such as Labor for Palestine Winnipeg. In one post, the Gazan-Canadian League says the process relies on vetting Palestinians with documents which are not available due to Israeli bombing and destruction, and that the process is delayed because Canadian officials have, quote, capitulated to racists both inside and outside of the government. Some of the arguments that they make, as we just mentioned, is that the documents required to properly vet Palestinian refugees to come into Canada were destroyed due to bombing and the war that's happening in that region. But when you have Ukrainian refugees who were streamlined at a much higher rate. Now, that country is also at war. There are regions that are facing bombardment and active fighting. And there were a lot of Ukrainian refugees, but with Gazans, there were only about 500 who were allowed to come to Canada as refugees since October 7th, despite the government, the Liberals, originally planning a 5,000 person quota. So could you enlighten us on why does it take so much longer for Gazan refugees to come to Canada and what's at play there?
Yeah, absolutely, Cosmin. So True North has spoken to both Jewish rights groups and an immigration lawyer about the logistics behind accepting Gazan refugees into Canada in the past, including last year. And they bring up the fact that the area is ruled by a terrorist organization, Hamas, who simply does not keep the same records one might expect an immigrant from Ukraine to have available to them. They lack the infrastructure that's needed for proper background checks. Without proper records or a trustworthy administrative body in the country, True North's been told that there simply is no accurate way to determine whether or not the people we would be accepting from the region are supporters of terrorism or agents of the terrorist group Hamas itself. Sergio Caris, the immigration lawyer I referenced, spoke to us and said many of the Palestinians seeking refuge in Canada illegally cross the border into places such as Egypt. And because of this, they also lack those proper documentation and identification needed to vet them. Both Caris and Jewish advocacy groups such as Dzsurdzsa have also pointed out recent polls in the region which show massive levels of support for the Hamas-led October 7th attack, which left 1,200 Israelis slaughtered and hundreds more kidnapped, with some still being held captive today. And people from the region report high levels of anti-Semitic opinions as well. So both critics of Gazan immigration point out that this would almost guarantee that the already rising levels of anti-Semitism in Canada would skyrocket even further, not to mention how difficult it is historically in Canada to deport terrorists once they're already here.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.